I have always believed that the things we dismiss are the most honest things in the room. In 41 years of working museum acquisitions, cultural registration, and what the younger staff charitably called legacy cataloging, I learned one immovable truth: the piece with no provenance card, no donor plaque, no dramatic lighting above it. That is the piece worth your time. Not the tall things, not the things under glass with brass labels and a motion sensor alarm, the quiet ones. The ones that arrived in a cardboard box with a note that said in bureaucratic shorthand, origin unknown, culture undetermined, estimated age indeterminate, value, decorative. That last word always made me laugh. Decorative. As if someone sat down with their lunch and decided, we don't understand it, and it doesn't fit anywhere, so let's say it's pretty and move on. 37 years ago, a crate came in from a surface survey team working the old plateau district on the colony's eastern margin. The team had been out there doing routine geological mapping, looking for the usual things, useful things, things with material value, and they found a small stone chamber half buried under a shelf of collapsed sediment. Inside the chamber, wrapped in something that had long since crumbled to a gray powder, was a figurine, palm-sized, unremarkable to the eye, carved from a stone I still cannot identify with certainty. Something between basalt and obsidian, but lighter than either, with a surface grain that runs in very faint parallel lines if you catch it at the right angle, to the light. The carving itself was precise. A seated figure, legs folded, hands resting open on its knees, head bowed slightly as if in thought. Around the base, a band of script I had never seen in any record, and that the linguistic registry team classified, after 2 months of cross-referencing, as pre-colonial and non-human in origin, probable age unknown, functional meaning indeterminate. So it sat in a back case in Gallery 7 for 37 years. The case was the one near the utility corridor, the one you passed on your way to the staff bathroom, the one that got cleaned last and lit with whatever bulb maintenance had on hand that week. Gallery 7 was the miscellaneous room, the room for things that didn't fit into the main story the museum was telling. Frontier survey finds, unclassified minerals, 2 botanical specimens in deteriorating resin that had been donated in the museum's first decade and never properly cataloged, a hand-drawn map of the original colony grid that someone's grandmother had made, and that was probably not accurate but was certainly sincere. And on the 3rd shelf of the 4th case on the left wall, the little figure. I moved it once in my 2nd year. The previous registrar had placed it in a position where it faced the wall, which struck me as strange. Not wrong exactly. The thing was decorative, after all, and it wasn't as though it had preferences, but strange. I turned it so it faced outward, toward the room. The overnight cleaning staff moved it back against the wall within a week. I turned it around again. They moved it again. After the 3rd time, I left it as they had it, facing the wall. Whether that was their preference or the figures, I never determined, and I remember telling myself at the time that the question was absurd because objects do not have preferences. And in 41 years of working with objects, I have never once fully believed that sentence. I am telling you this because I want you to understand the texture of how ordinary it all was. There was no drama around the thing. There was no rumor, no tradition, no local legend about it. None of the visitors who wandered through Gallery 7, and there were not many. It was not a destination room. Stopped to look at it with any particular interest. Children occasionally pressed their noses to the glass, because children press their noses to glass wherever they find it. Scholars who visited the museum for research purposes occasionally asked to see the acquisition log for Gallery 7, and I would walk them through it, and they would look at the figure's entry, pre-colonial, non-human script, decorative, and move on to something with more documentation. One visiting linguist in my 19th year asked to examine the script up close. I opened the case. She looked at it for about 4 minutes. She said the character forms were unlike anything in her reference database. She photographed it from 3 angles, and she left. I never heard from her again, which is not unusual. The world is full of researchers who take photographs and say they'll follow up and mean it at the time. The figure itself attracted no special attention. It sat where it sat. It looked like what it looked like. Everybody assumed they understood what it was. That is the thing about 41 years. After long enough, you stop noticing what you stopped noticing. The figurine became part of the furniture of my professional life, in the way that certain things in a long, inhabited room become furniture, present, familiar, below the threshold of active attention. I saw it every time I walked Gallery 7, which was nearly every working day of my career, and I registered it with the peripheral awareness of someone registering something that has always been there and is expected to always be there, which is just not really registering it at all. My last day at the museum was a Tuesday in late autumn, when the light through the high corridor windows was the color of old bone and the heating system was making the noise it made every year at the first cold snap, a low rhythmic knocking that the facilities team had been meaning to fix since before I arrived and would presumably keep meaning to fix until the building fell down. I had packed my desk the week before. The personal things, the letters, the framed photograph of my daughter at age 7 standing in front of the survey ruin outside Carath, squinting into the sun with her hand up as a visor, a child doing her best impression of a serious person examining serious terrain. The official things, the archive keys, the seal stamps, the master acquisition log. I had handed to Dale, my replacement, a young man of 32 with excellent organizational instincts and a slight tendency to overlabel. I had told him this gently, as a collegial note, and he had taken it seriously and written it down, which told me he was going to be fine. What I had not done was walk the galleries one last time. It was not sentiment. I am not a sentimental person, or at any rate, I have spent most of my adult life pretending I am not, which amounts to the same thing in practice. It was professional completeness. 41 years of walking those rooms had made the walk a reflex, and I thought, I will say thought, that I owed the rooms one last pass before I handed them to someone else. So at 3:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, with my coat over my arm and my bag over my shoulder, and the heating knock counting time somewhere behind the walls, I walked the galleries. Gallery 1, Colonial History, the Founding Generation. Gallery 2, the planet's geological record, the core samples and the topographic maps. Gallery 3, pre-colonial survey findings, the things found before the settlement, the things that said someone was here before us in ways we didn't fully understand and mostly preferred not to examine too closely. Gallery 4, Industry and Agriculture, the practical story of how the colony fed itself and built itself. Gallery 5, Cultural Objects donated by first and second generation families. The personal things, the domestic things, the things that do not look important until you understand what it costs to carry them across the void between worlds. Gallery 6, the Science and Communications Archive, the logs and the instruments and the correspondence that constituted the colony's official record of itself. Gallery 7, Miscellaneous. I have walked that circuit thousands of times. I could do it with my eyes closed. And on certain days when the cleaning crew had left the floors still damp, and the ceiling lights were doing that particular flicker, that meant a ballast transformer was failing. I had effectively done it with my eyes closed. I know every case. I know every label. I know which display panels are slightly warped from humidity cycling, and which floor sections creak in winter, and which glass panes have a scratch near the lower left corner from an incident involving a school group and an unsupervised metal ruler that we never fully reconstructed. I know the particular quality of the silence in each gallery. How Gallery 1 is always slightly formal, the silence of a room that considers itself important. How Gallery 5 is warm, the silence of a room that holds things people loved. How Gallery 7 is different from both of these. Quieter and less defined, the silence of a room that isn't sure what it is for. I know Gallery 7 well enough that I could have walked through it in 30 seconds, given it the professional nod, and been at the exit and out into the cold afternoon air before 4 o'clock. Instead, I stopped. I don't know why I stopped. I have asked myself that question many times since, and the honest answer is that I don't know. I was walking past the fourth case on the left wall, the one with the crumbling botanical specimens and the inaccurate grandmother's map and the little stone figure on the third shelf, and something made me stop. Not a sound, not a light. Nothing visible had changed. The figure was where it always was. Oriented as I had long since stopped fighting about, facing the wall, its back to the room, the faint parallel grain in the stone, catching what light there was at an angle that made it look, in certain moods, almost as if the surface had depth. I stopped and I looked at it. I had looked at it hundreds of times, thousands of times. I had looked at it with the dutiful professional attention of someone maintaining a consistent catalog. And I had looked at it with the private sideways attention of someone who suspects a thing, is more interesting than it appears, but has no evidence, and too much work to pursue the suspicion. I had looked at it when I was tired, and when I was alert, and when I was thinking about something else, entirely. I had never looked at it and felt anything I would have called significant. But I stopped on my last afternoon and looked at it, and something in the quality of the looking was different, not dramatic, not revelatory, just different, as if the long professional habit of registering it as known had slipped. And for a moment, I was looking at it the way I had looked at it in my second year, when it was still new to me and I was still capable of finding it strange. I set my bag down. I took my coat off my arm and folded it over the bag. I unlocked the case. I still had the gallery keys. I hadn't turned those in yet. That was one of the things on my list for the last hour of the day, and I opened the glass front. I had opened this case before for cleaning, for positioning, for the occasional documentation photograph when the archive team was updating the records. I had handled the figure before. There is a note in the acquisition log, in my handwriting, from about a decade into my tenure, that reads, "Object handled for photographic documentation, no change noted, surface integrity uncompromised, weight approximately 340 grams. I remember writing that note. I remember the weight of the thing in my hand. I remember thinking that for something so old and strange it felt remarkably ordinary. Dense, smooth, cool, like a river stone you might pick up for the pleasure of the weight. I reached in and picked it up. It felt the same. The weight was right. The temperature was right. Cool, not cold. The ambient warmth of a room temperature case on a chilly afternoon. I turned it in my hands the way I had turned it before, looking at the base inscription, looking at the seated figure's carved face, which was serene and slightly ambiguous, the way carvings of faces are when they are very old and the features have been worn to suggestion rather than precision. I looked at the script and let myself do what I had never allowed myself to do in a professional capacity, which was to simply admit that I could not read it, and that not being able to read it bothered me, had always bothered me, had sat at the back of my catalog for 37 years, like a drawer I couldn't open. The script ran around the full circumference of the base. It was not decorative in the casual sense. The character spacing was too deliberate, the line weight too consistent, the overall composition too purposeful to be mere ornamentation. Whatever it said, it had been carved by someone who intended it to be read. The fact that no one had been able to read it was not the inscription's failure. It was the gap between the inscription and the right reader. I held it for a long time, long enough that the heating knock had moved through several of its cycles and the afternoon light through the corridor had shifted from old bone to something closer to ash. Then, because I was about to put it back, because my hand was already beginning the motion of return, of replacing it on the third shelf in the position it had always occupied, I did something I had never done before. I pressed my palm flat against the seated figure's back, not the grip I'd used before. Nothing professional or careful, just my whole warm palm pressed against the cool flat surface of the thing. The script lit up. I will try to describe this accurately, because I have told it several times now, and I am aware that in the telling it, acquires a drama that was not present in the moment. In the moment, it was not dramatic. It was precise. The script around the base of the figure illuminated from within, not a glow like a lamp, not a pulse like something electrical, but a steady, warm, golden light that rose through the stone the way heat rises through glass, slowly, evenly, from no single point. The lines of script became legible in a way that had nothing to do with light and everything to do with comprehension. The way certain things you have looked at for years will suddenly resolve into meaning, not because they changed, but because something in the looking finally aligned. I read the script. I do not speak that language. I have never spoken that language. I cannot speak it now if I try to produce the sounds deliberately. But in the moment of the illumination, I read it the way you read something in a dream, perfectly, without effort, without translation, as if it had always been your mother tongue and you had simply forgotten. The inscription read, "She who carried the line without knowing it carried it. She who kept the record when the record had no keeper. She who held the room when the room held nothing else worth holding." The figure rose, not quickly, not dramatically. It lifted from my palm the way a soap bubble lifts from water. No force, no sudden motion, just the slow, smooth transfer of weight from my hand into the air, until it was hovering at the height of my sternum, perfectly still, perfectly level, the golden light steady and unhurried through its surface. And then it spoke, not sound, not a voice in the room, a voice in the understanding, the same channel as the script, the same immediate clarity, as if meaning were arriving without the intermediate step of language. It said, "Eldest Queen." The line holds. I stood in Gallery 7 on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn and held very still. I am 71 years old. I have a knee that aches in cold weather and a reading prescription that has changed 3 times in the past decade, and a coffee habit that my doctor has requested twice now that I moderate. I am retired as of today. I have a small house on the northern quarter of the colony settlement with a garden I have been meaning to improve for approximately 15 years, and a daughter who visits 3 times a year and who has inherited, to my quietly expressed pride, a complete inability to leave an unlabeled thing unlabeled. I am not a queen. I am not anyone's heir. I am a cultural registrar of 41 years standing with a good eye for provenance and a genuine, unglamorous love for the part of the job that everyone else found tedious, which was the systematic, patient, unhurried work of maintaining accurate records for things that had no obvious value, things that sat in back cases near utility corridors and got cleaned last and lit with whatever bulb was available, things that everyone had decided, without much examination, were decorative. I stood still for a long time. The figure hovered. The light held. The heating knocked its patient count somewhere behind the wall. I thought about the first time I had picked it up, in my 2nd year, when I turned it to face the room, and it faced the wall again within a week. I thought about the note in the acquisition log, weight approximately 340 grams, surface integrity uncompromised, no change noted, and how precise and useless that note was, how correctly it described the object, and how completely it missed the point. I thought about the survey team that found it, the geological mapping team looking for useful things, material things, who dug it out of its chamber and wrapped it in their field jacket, and brought it back because it was small enough to carry and strange enough to seem worth carrying, and they didn't know what else to do with it. I thought about all the people who had walked past it in 37 years, including me on thousands of mornings, and how none of us had stopped long enough to press a palm to the back of it and simply hold it. I thought, well, and then I thought something else, which was harder to put into words but which felt, in its substance, something like this. The record keeping was not incidental. The room tending was not incidental. 41 years of maintaining accurate accounts of things no one else was looking at. That was not a career that happened to end in a museum. That was something else. That was the thing the inscription described. She who kept the record when the record had no keeper. She who held the room when the room held nothing else worth holding. I had not been waiting for a revelation. I had not been carrying a private sense that my life was preparation for something. I am not that kind of person, and I have never told myself that kind of story. But standing in Gallery 7, with the figure hovering at chest height and the gold light steady in the stone, I felt, with a quietness that I think surprised me more than the light did, that this was true, that the inscription was accurate, not metaphorically accurate, not poetically accurate, accurate in the way a good catalog entry is accurate, which is the only kind of accuracy that has ever interested me. I pulled a chair over from the wall, one of the visitor benches, the low wooden ones, and sat down. The figure descended slightly, the way it had risen, unhurried, until it was level with my seated eyeline, still hovering, still lit, the script still turning slowly around the base, the way a slow current moves through still water. I said out loud to an empty museum gallery, "Tell me what this means." The response was not words, exactly. It was more like the expansion of what I already understood, as if the translation mechanism that had given me the inscription was now running in the other direction, taking what I meant and returning what was meant back. What came was something like this: the line is old, older than the colony, older than the served teams and the geological maps and the frontier settlements, and the language in which I had spent my entire professional life keeping records. The line had moved through a great many generations on a great many worlds before it arrived here, carried by people who did not know they were carrying it, people who did not look like royalty or act like royalty or have any reason to believe they were anything other than what they appeared to be, which was ordinary, careful, attentive, the kind of people who kept the records and maintained the rooms and cataloged the things that other people dismissed. Not despite those qualities, because of them. I sat with that for a moment. Because of them. I had spent 41 years in a profession that the wider colonial administration considered supporting at best and peripheral at worst. Museums were not mining operations. They did not generate revenue or export material or contribute directly to the practical business of making a frontier world habitable. They were, in the language of the budget committees that I had sat in front of twice a decade for most of my career, a cultural amenity, a soft priority, fundable in good years and trimmable in lean ones. I had never argued against this characterization the way some of my colleagues had, with passion and volume at professional gatherings. I had argued against it the way I argued against most things that I considered wrong, which was quietly and persistently, and through the simple accumulation of evidence over a long time. I had kept better records than anyone required me to keep. I had flagged things for attention that would otherwise have been lost. I had written notes in files and followed up on those notes and written the follow-up notes and followed up on those and kept doing it, not because anyone was watching or rewarding or even particularly noticing, but because the work was real and the things in the cases were real, and a real thing deserved an accurate account of itself. She who kept the record when the record had no keeper. The figurine was not a message left for a bloodline. It was not a trap for an heir or a test for a successor. It was a record, the most patient kind of record, one that waited to be found by someone who understood records the way they deserved to be understood, which was as the truest available description of what was real, I said. And what does the line hold? What am I queen of? The response was slower this time, or perhaps I was slower in receiving it. It felt less like translation and more like excavation, like something being carefully removed from depth rather than handed across a counter. What I received was this: the line does not hold territory. It does not hold a throne or a title or a governing authority over any living population. What the line holds is a kind of function, a word the figure used that came to me most accurately as stewardship, though that word is smaller than what was meant. The stewardship of things that would otherwise be lost. The custodianship of records whose keepers had died or dispersed or simply stopped. The capacity to maintain an accurate account of what was real when those around you had decided it was easier to declare something decorative and Move on. I sat with that for a moment. That's what I've been doing for 41 years, I said. The light in the figure steadied. Not a pulse. Not a brightening, just a quality of stillness that felt, in the translation channel, like, yes. And there were others, I said. It was not a question. The logic of what the figure had shown me, the line moving through generations, through worlds, through people who did not know they were carrying it, meant that there had been others before me and would be others after, assuming the line continued to hold. What came back was something I can only describe as a held breath followed by a considered exhale. Something like yes and no. Yes, there had been others in the line. No, they had not always been found, and the finding, this moment, this contact, this small act of a warm palm on cool stone in an empty museum gallery on a Tuesday afternoon, was not guaranteed. The line could have ended here. The figure could have sat for another 37 years, or another 300, or another 3,000, if the right person had never come. The line had come close to ending before, on other worlds, in other rooms, in cases less well-maintained than mine. I asked about those cases, the ones that had not been well-maintained, the rooms where no one had kept coming back. What came was not precisely grief, though there was something adjacent to grief in it. More like the weight of accurate accounting, the honest ledger that records loss alongside continuance. There had been keepers before me who were lost before they found what they were keeping. There had been chambers sealed and then broken, records destroyed in the ordinary catastrophes of civilization, fires, floods, the administrative clearances that happen when a new authority decides that the previous authority's accumulated documentation is clutter. There had been objects like the figure that had been separated from their lines by the indifferent currents of trade and donation and misattribution, ending in the wrong rooms, in the wrong hands, unrecognized. I thought about the visiting linguist in my 19th year, who had looked at the script for 4 minutes and taken photographs and left and never followed up. I thought about what would have happened if I had not been here, if the figure had been in a worse room, a less maintained case, an institution without even a mid-level registrar, with a quiet stubbornness about accurate records. If it had ended in a storage facility with no gallery access, or in a private collection whose owner had paid for the aesthetic and had no interest, in the script, or in a landfill somewhere at the end of a dissolved museum's final inventory clearance. I thought about that for a while. The figure held still. The light held steady. I kept the room, I said, but I didn't know I was keeping it for this. The translation channel gave me something quiet and simple. That was precisely why it worked. I thought about the survey team that had wrapped it in their field jacket and brought it back. I thought about the acquisition process that had cataloged it and given it a case, however unremarkable a case. I thought about the fact that it was still here, still intact, still accessible, that it had not been lost or discarded or misfiled into permanent obscurity, that had not been inevitable, that had been the result of the kind of institutional maintenance that everyone considers beneath notice, until the thing that depended on it is gone. A dozen small decisions made by a dozen people who had no idea they were participating in something larger than a Tuesday afternoon's routine. The survey team that brought the crate back instead of leaving it in the field. The intake registrar who assigned it a case instead of a storage shelf. The facilities manager who replaced the case's glass when it cracked in my 25th year. The budget committee that had approved, without enthusiasm, the annual conservation line item that included climate control for Gallery 7. None of them knew. All of them held something. The line holds. I said, because the room held. The translation channel delivered something that was not quite agreement and not quite correction, but something in between, something that felt like, more precisely, the room held because you held it. And you held it because it was the right thing to do. And it was the right thing to do because you are what you are, which is what the line has always been made of. People who understand that the right thing to do and the unremarked thing to do are, very often, the same thing. I am not a person who cries easily or often or in public spaces. I have cried 4 times as an adult that I can identify with clarity. Once at my daughter's birth, once when my husband died, once on the day I realized that the second-generation settler diaries we had been trying to archive for a decade were too water-damaged to recover, and once. This may tell you something about me, when a first-edition copy of the original Colony Survey Report, which I had been trying to locate for the better part of 6 years, arrived in a donation box from an estate sale and turned out to be in perfect condition, every page intact, the handwritten annotations in the margins still legible, the whole document exactly as its maker had left it. I did not cry in Gallery 7. I will tell you that plainly. What I felt was not grief, and it was not joy exactly, though it was closer to joy than to anything else. It was more like what I had felt when the survey report arrived, the specific, profound, slightly stunned feeling of finding that a thing you had been maintaining accurate records of was exactly as real as the records said it was, that the work had been right, that the keeping had been worth the keeping. After a while, I don't know how long, the light had gone fully blue-gray by then, and the museum was quiet in the way it got after the last visitor had left, and before the cleaning crew arrived, I stood up. The figure dropped slowly back to my palm when I extended it. The gold light did not go out. It had, I realized, simply become the stone's natural state, or what I now understood to be its natural state. The state it had been in for a very long time before anyone thought to press a warm palm to its back and hold still. I stood in Gallery 7, my last day in this building, and I held it. I thought about the inscription again. She who carried the line without knowing it carried it. That part had always seemed, would have seemed, if I'd been able to read it 37 years ago, like something you would feel you ought to have known, like a gap in your self-knowledge you should be embarrassed about. But standing there with the light in my hand, I did not feel that. I felt the opposite of that. The not knowing had been part of it. The not knowing was, in its way, the qualification. An heir who knew they were an heir would have arrived at this case with an agenda, with expectations, with the kind of self-conscious weight that warps how you look at things. I had arrived at this case on this last afternoon as a woman cleaning out her desk, slightly tired, slightly sentimental, walking the galleries one more time out of professional reflex and the obscure courtesy of 41 years of belonging somewhere. I had arrived with nothing. And in arriving with nothing, I had brought exactly what was needed. I considered briefly what to do next. Not the grand version of that question, not the long geopolitical what does this mean for human civilization version, which I was quite sure would take me more than the 15 minutes remaining before the cleaning crew arrived. The practical version. What do I do next right now in the next quarter hour? I put the chair back. I relocked the case, the figure still in my hand. I picked up my coat and my bag. I turned off the Gallery 7 lights. I walked to the front of the museum, signed out in the staff log for the last time. Marin Voss, out 1714, followed by the small box I had always drawn around my initials. The private code I had used since my first week and never explained to anyone. And walked out into the cold afternoon. The figure was in my coat pocket. Its weight was the same, approximately 340 grams. But the light, muted now through the fabric, made the outside of the pocket warm against my hand. I did not know the full scope of what I was now. I did not know what the function meant across the span of a life, or what it would ask of me, or whether it would ask anything at all beyond what I had already given it, which was 41 years of keeping the records and maintaining the rooms, and refusing to write off as decorative the things that other people found it convenient to dismiss. I did not know if there were others in this line somewhere, doing the same work in other rooms on other worlds. I did not know if anyone was waiting for me to report somewhere, or announce myself, or begin some process I was not yet aware of. What I knew was this. The figure said the line holds, and the figure had been right about everything it had said so far. I turned up my collar against the cold and walked home through the autumn light. My daughter called that evening, She always calls on Tuesdays, which is a habit that began in her childhood, and which I have always privately found more moving than I have ever told her. We talked about her work. She is a survey linguist, which I have never believed is a coincidence, though I have never told her that either, and about the garden, and about whether the old heating system in my house was going to survive another winter, which we both knew it was not, and about her visit at the winter solstice, which we had been planning since the summer, and which I was looking forward to with the uncomplicated pleasure of a person who has arranged her life to make room for what matters. I did not tell her about Gallery 7, not yet, not because I was keeping a secret, exactly, but because there are things that want time before they want words, and this was one of them. I wanted to carry it a while in the original, to understand what it meant in its own terms before I tried to explain it in anyone else's. After she rang off, I sat in the kitchen with the figure on the table in front of me, its light steady in the overhead kitchen lamp, and I thought about the inscription one more time. All 3 lines of it. She who carried the line without knowing it. She who kept the record when the record had no keeper. She who held the room when the room held nothing else worth holding. I thought about the cleaning staff who had kept turning the figure to face the wall, and about how I had stopped fighting them, and about how the figure had spent most of its 37 years in this museum oriented exactly as they left it, away from the room, toward the wall, apparently indifferent to the question of which direction it faced. And I thought about how, on my first inspection of it, I had found that strange, not wrong, just strange, as if someone had not thought through the positioning. Now I thought, or as if the positioning did not matter, because the thing it was waiting for was not to be looked at. It was waiting to be picked up, by someone who would not pick it up looking for what it was, by someone who would pick it up as a reflex on the last day of a long tenure, out of professional completeness and the quiet habit of 41 years, by someone who would hold it not with the focused attention of a seeker, but with the distracted, slightly tired, entirely genuine attention of a person who had touched this object hundreds of times and was touching it one more time, because that was what you did when you had spent your life taking care of things. She who held the room when the room held nothing else worth holding. The heating system knocked twice in the kitchen pipes, the same rhythm it had knocked all day, and then went quiet in the way it sometimes did in the evening, as if it had worked out whatever the problem was for another few hours. The figure's light was warm on the table. The kitchen was still. I thought about what it means to hold a line you did not know you were holding, to carry a function through a lifetime's work without ever being told what the function was, without any instruction or revelation or sign, just the long, patient practice of keeping accurate records and maintaining the rooms and refusing to declare things decorative when they were not. I thought, most of the important work looks like that. Most of the important work looks like maintenance. Most of the lines that matter are held by people who do not know they are holding them, in rooms that no one thinks to monitor, through careers that the budget committees consider soft priorities. The lines that look important are usually the ones that have already broken. The lines that hold are the ones in the rooms where someone kept coming back, kept cleaning the case, kept updating the log, kept turning the thing toward the light even when the cleaning staff kept turning it away again. And then I stopped thinking about it and made a cup of tea, because I am 71 years old and it was nearly 7 in the evening, and the figure was on the table, and the line, as it had apparently been holding for longer than I could calculate, was continuing to hold. The next morning I woke before dawn, which I have done for most of my adult life, and which I had assumed would change in retirement. It did not change. The body has its own trackers and does not consult you before updating them. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window in the pre-dawn dark and looked at the garden that I had been meaning to improve for 15 years. And I thought about what I was going to do with the rest of my time. The figure was on the kitchen table where I had left it. In the dark of early morning, before the outside light had come up, The gold of it was the brightest thing in the room. Not bright enough to illuminate anything, not a lamp, not a light source in any practical sense, but present in a way that a dark room notices. I brought my coffee to the table and sat across from it. I had spent 41 years keeping records for an institution. The institution had certain constraints: funding, space, staffing, the particular politics of a mid-sized colonial museum on a frontier world where history was still recent enough that some of it was controversial. I had worked within those constraints because that was the work. And the constraints were not wrong. They were just the shape of the room in which the work happened. I did not have those constraints now. I thought about the second-generation settler diaries that had been too water damaged to recover. I had tried everything I had available to me as a museum registrar. There were techniques beyond what a museum registrar had access to, beyond what the museum's budget and mandate covered, that I had never been able to pursue. I had made a note in the file: materials beyond current recovery capacity, recommended for specialist review if funding becomes available. The funding had not become available. The note was still in the file. I thought about a survey site in the Mountain Plateau District, about 40 kilometers east of the colony margin, that the geological teams had partially excavated in my 12th year, and then closed when the survey mandate changed. There were objects logged from that site that had never been properly classified. 17 items in a temporary holding status that had been temporary for nearly 30 years. I had raised it 3 times in acquisition meetings. The response was always the same: we don't have the resources to open that file right now, and the mandate doesn't cover extended plateau survey work. I thought about a sealed crate in the Deep Archive, Sub-Level 2, Section C, that had arrived as part of a bulk donation from a dissolved survey company. And that contained, according to the original donation manifest, objects of pre-colonial origin, exact nature unspecified, requiring specialist assessment. The crate had been in Sub-Level 2, Section C, for 22 years. I had flagged it for assessment in my 23rd year, and again in my 30th. Both times the flag was acknowledged and the assessment was deferred. I sat with my coffee and the light of the figure, and a list that had been building in the back of the acquisition log of my mind for the better part of 4 decades. She who kept the record when the record had no keeper. I had kept the record within the institution, within its funding and its mandate and its space and its staffing and its particular way of deciding what was worth its time. I had kept it as well as those constraints allowed, which I believe was well enough. The figure was on the table, the line held. But the institution had limits, and I no longer worked for the institution. There was something clarifying about that sentence. I had worked within institutions for my entire adult life, and I had been, I think, good at it, not because I was naturally compliant, but because I understood that institutions are how a single person's work survives beyond a single person's tenure. A museum outlasts its registrars. The catalog outlasts the cataloger. If you care about the records being kept, you care about the institution that keeps them, even when the institution is frustrating, even when it underfunds the things that matter and overfunds the things that look impressive and loses 3 perfectly good staff members in a single year to better paying positions elsewhere. You work within it, because the alternative is that the work ends when you end, and the work should not end when you end. But there is a difference between working within an institution and being bounded by one. I had not fully understood that difference until this morning, sitting at the kitchen table in the pre-dawn dark, with a figurine that had just told me I was the eldest queen of a line of custodians stretching back further than my institution's mandate, covered by several orders of magnitude. The institution's limits were not my limits. They were the shape of one room. I had other rooms to tend now. I wrote the list, and I wrote it carefully, the way I had always written acquisition entries, specific, dated, with enough detail that someone coming to the record cold would understand exactly what they were looking at, and exactly what remained to be done. Not a wish list, a work plan. The difference matters. A wish list is something you make when you want to feel as though you are doing something, without actually committing to do it. A work plan is a record of intention specific enough to be held accountable to. I got out a notebook, a physical one, not a file, not a system. A notebook with a dark cover and unlined pages that I had been given as a retirement gift by the archive team, and that I had been carrying in my bag for the past week without opening, the way you carry a new thing before you know what it is for. I opened it to the first page, wrote the date at the top, and began the list. The settler diaries, the plateau survey closure, the crate in sublevel 2, the figure, and what the figure had said, and what the figure suggested about the kind of work that had not yet been done, because the kind of work it was, did not fit neatly into an institutional mandate. Then I wrote other sites, because the figure had shown me that the line had moved through multiple worlds, and I had spent my career in one museum on one world, and the logical implication of that arithmetic was uncomfortable in a way that I found, on reflection, not uncomfortable at all. More like a familiar problem presented at a scale I had not previously had permission to address. The list was longer than I expected. It usually is when you finally write a thing down after carrying it in your head for decades. When the dawn came up through the kitchen window, I was still writing. My daughter called again on Thursday, which was not a Tuesday, and was therefore not her usual pattern, which meant she had something she wanted to say that couldn't wait until next week. She had been thinking, she said, about the sealed crate in sublevel 2. She had heard me mention it over the years, she said, and she had done some research on the donation manifest, because she was her mother's daughter, and she had inherited the complete inability to leave, an unlabeled thing unlabeled. She had found, in the archive of the dissolved survey company's original field logs, a reference to the crate that did not appear in the donation manifest. The field log entry was brief. It said, Chamber find, Plateau District East Margin, multi-object, probable pre-colonial complex origin, translator flags non-human script consistent with earlier findings. Recommend specialist review. Flag, do not open in the field. She was a survey linguist. She had access to translation tools and cross-reference script databases that a museum registrar had never had. I told her about Gallery 7. There was a long silence on her end, and then she said, very precisely, in the voice she uses when she is being careful with language, the inscription on the base. Can you describe the script? I described it. The character forms, the spacing conventions, the particular way the strokes weighted at their terminals. She was quiet for another moment, and then she said, Mom, I've seen that script, I said. Where? She said. On a site survey I did 3 years ago. Northern Range, the ridge system above the old geological station. There was a half-buried structure. We logged it and moved on because it wasn't in our mandate, and the team lead didn't want to open a separate work order. But I photographed everything. I have 200 photographs of that site sitting in my personal archive because I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I could not bring myself to simply file the job and close the folder. I said, I'm going to need to see those photographs, she said. I was going to say the same thing about your figurine. The winter solstice visit moved by 2 months, which my daughter managed by taking her accumulated survey leave, which was considerable because she was, by her own and her team lead's accounting, the kind of person who worked through leave accumulating rather than spending it, always meaning to take it later, always finding something that needed her attention now. She arrived on a Saturday morning with her field bag and her photograph archive, and the particular focused energy of someone who has been sitting on a thing for 3 years and has finally been given a reason to unpack it. We sat at the kitchen table with the figure between us. The kitchen was the same kitchen it had always been, the same window looking out on the same unimproved garden, the same shelf of reference books above the same small desk where I had done the overflow work I couldn't finish at the museum. The same coffee maker my husband had chosen because it was simple and reliable, and he had trusted simple, reliable things. My daughter had grown up in this house. She had sat at this table for homework and for arguments and for the long, slow Sunday meals that we had made a family habit of. She knew this room in the way you know a room you have been in since childhood, not with attention, but with the body's memory, the kind of knowledge that doesn't need eyes. She saw the figure and she stopped. I watched her see it. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her field bag over one shoulder and her travel case still in her hand, and she looked at it the way I had looked. At it in Gallery 7, not with the practiced quick assessment of a professional, but with the sudden arrested attention of someone encountering something that has just become a different kind of object than it was a moment ago. She put down the travel case. She put down the field bag. She sat down across from me. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. She is careful about things she doesn't fully understand, which is one of the qualities she has that I find most admirable and that I have never adequately told her I admire. She asked me to describe what happened when I picked it up. I described it. She asked me to describe the script as it appeared when it illuminated. I described it. She got out her photograph archive and pulled up the images from the Northern Range site and turned the screen toward me. The script was the same, not similar. The same line weight, the same character forms, the same spacing conventions, the same terminal weighting on the downstrokes. I have an eye for that. 41 years of looking at inscriptions from a dozen distinct pre-colonial traditions had given me, among other things, a reliable instinct. For when two samples of script came from the same hand or the same workshop or the same orthographic tradition, even across large distances and long times, you develop a feeling for it that is not quite analysis and not quite intuition, but somewhere in the territory between them. Reliable in the way that long familiarity with a thing makes you reliable about it. This was not across a large distance or a long time in the sense I was used to reasoning about. This was a different site, on the other side of the planet's northern range. 3 years before I found the figurine in Gallery 7, surveyed by a team that had never visited the museum and had no knowledge of the acquisition log. The script was the same. My daughter said, "There's more." She pulled up a second archive on the screen. This one was not from her own fieldwork. It was from the Survey Linguistic Registry, the institutional database she had access to through her work, the one that cataloged script samples from across the colonial network, pooling finds from dozens of survey teams on dozens of worlds into a single cross-referenced index. She had been running queries, she said, since Thursday. Quiet queries structured to avoid generating automated flags that would route her searches to a supervisor's attention. The kind of careful, methodical, low-profile investigation that I recognized immediately, because it was exactly how I had operated for 41 years in the museum. Doing the thorough work without advertising that you were doing it, because the moment you advertised it, someone with a mandate and a budget would decide whether it was worth their time. And the answer was usually, not yet. She had found 11 other sites, not on this world, on other worlds, on the outer margin survey records and the deep-range colonial archives, with script matching the same orthographic tradition. 11 sites spread across a survey arc that spanned 4 colonial-era decades and 6 different survey teams that had never been in contact with each other, logging finds they could not classify and moving on, because the mandate didn't cover extended analysis of things that were difficult to understand, finds that had been photographed, logged, flagged for specialist review, and then quietly placed in holding status while the teams moved on to the next site and the next budget cycle and the next thing that was more urgently needed somewhere else. She who kept the record when the record had no keeper. I looked at my daughter across the kitchen table, with the figurine's gold light steady between us, and I felt the list in my notebook grow several pages longer all at once. "We're going to need a bigger table," she said. "We're going to need a different kind of institution," I said. She considered that for a moment, the way she considers things. Seriously, with her full attention, without the reflex to agree or disagree before she's thought it through. Then she nodded. Or the same kind, she said, but without the constraints. That was it, exactly. That was the thing I had been working around to from the beginning, without quite reaching it. The work was not new. The work was the same work, the keeping of accurate records, the maintenance of the rooms, the refusal to declare things decorative when they were not. What was new was the scope of the room. I reached across and picked up the figurine. The gold light was steady in my palm. My daughter watched it and did not say anything, and I could see in the quality of her attention that she was doing what she always does when she encounters something she doesn't fully understand. She was keeping a very careful record of it, I thought. Of course she is. She who carried the line without knowing it carried it. I set the figurine down on the table between us and opened my notebook to the list and said, "All right, let's start at the beginning." Outside the kitchen window, the garden was cold and bare. In the morning light, the soil turned over by the first frosts. The beds that I had been meaning to improve for 15 years, open and ready and waiting for spring. The light was the pale, clear light of early winter, flat and honest, the kind of light that shows you things as they are rather than how you want them to be. It was, I thought, a very good light in which to begin keeping a record. The line held. It had held for longer than any of us could calculate, in rooms that no one thought worth watching, through keepers who did not know they were keeping anything beyond the immediate and the ordinary, and the honestly attended to. It had moved through generations of people who took careful notes about things other people dismissed, who kept the cases clean and the labels accurate and the access doors unlocked for the people who might one day need to find what was inside. I am 71 years old. I have a knee that aches and a reading prescription that changes and a coffee habit my doctor has opinions about. I am a retired cultural registrar of 41 years standing, and this morning I am sitting at my kitchen table with my daughter and a list and a figurine that knows exactly what I am. The record was always real. The keeping was always worth the keeping. The line holds.